last time, while we were doing numbers, the tape finished before I had. So perhaps just for the sake of completeness, it was literally the last two chapters. And in chapter 35, we were doing about these cities of refuge, which were to be established in the Promised Land. And, or in fact, there were 3 established in the Promised Land, and there were 3 established just outside in the, amongst the Transjordan tribes, you'll remember. And we were seeing that the reason for these cities, they'd been manned by the Levites, and it was partially to do with Israel's legal system. And it was that if someone had killed somebody, you didn't have a police force, and the local city or the local town had to deal with any crimes. And often it was a member of the family who would go out, he was called the Avenger of Blood, who would go out to avenge the murderer if someone in the family had been murdered by them. But as a safety against miscarriages of justice, because after all, you might have a situation where someone had killed someone else, but it wasn't premeditated murder. It was a manslaughter situation, or maybe even a complete accident. Now, what happened was, because if you ended up in that situation, you'd have, sort of like the Avenger of Blood from that family after you to put you to death. The idea of the city of refuge was somewhere where you could flee to and you'd be given asylum. And what would happen was that the Levites would investigate and, they'd look into your case. And if they were happy that it was a question of accidental death, i.e. a manslaughter thing rather than murder, then they would grant refuge to you and keep you safe. And no Avenger of Blood could come anywhere near someone in a city of refuge once the Levites had agreed to give them asylum. However, if the Levites in their investigations concluded that you had actually murdered somebody and it was a premeditated thing, then in fact they would then hand you over to the Avenger of Blood, or the Kinsman Redeemer, as sometimes they were known as. So the cities of refuge were there to be a place to flee to, to make sure that there were no miscarriages of justice in the question of murder or manslaughter. So that was the idea there. And then the last chapter, chapter 36 in Numbers, dealt with various questions about inheritance, and particularly how it could be avoided that property might pass from members of one tribe to another. So the point is that if someone died and they left their land which belonged to that tribe, if they had no immediate family from the same tribe who could inherit, then it could have passed into belonging to someone from another tribe. And therefore the tribes would eventually lose their identity, and so there were rules in the inheritance laws to prevent property being transferred from one tribe to another. So that just finishes off the bit that the tape missed last time. Right, so today we come on to Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, and the name means the second law giving, or repetition of the law. Either of those translations will do. And when we were doing Numbers last time, we saw that the generation that came out of Egypt died in the wilderness, because at the end of the day only Joshua and Caleb got to go into the Promised Land. So the whole generation, all the people except from Joshua and Caleb, all the people who came out of Egypt into the wilderness, they all died during the 38-year period of the wilderness wanderings, and this was judgment on them, because as we saw last time, there was their chance to go into the Promised Land. God said go for it. This was just a year into their journeyings, and they said no, and they wouldn't do it, and so they forfeited it. So they all died in the wilderness, and so they had heard the law at Mount Sinai, and Moses had read it to them, expounded it to them, and they'd received all the teaching. But now, at this end of the Pentateuch, we're on the eve of them going into the Promised Land. So now, no one who was alive when Moses expounded the law the first time, 38 years earlier, at Mount Sinai, all the people alive then are dead. So all the people who are alive at this point, they haven't heard it. And so they're about to go into Jordan, and they're in the territory of Moab, just outside, literally a stone's throw away. And so basically what happens now is that Moses, in effect, goes over the law again. What he had done for the people who came out of Egypt, they're all dead. He now does for the people who were alive at the time when they were about to go into the promised land. So now, by way of instructing them, you get a book which amounts to the second applying of the law to the people of Israel. So really today we are going to be dealing with complete repetition, more or less, but we've got to do it, and I will, as usual, try and make it as fascinating as possible. And so basically what we've got here, the book is laid out in that Moses gives 3 discourses. So that is what this book records. Moses gives 3 discourses. They've all been in a similar period of time, all right? And we'll see where each one starts and ends. And basically, what he does is that he's applying Israel's past history. He's looking over their past history from the time that they came out of Egypt and all the wondrous wilderness. The wandering wilderness is the wilderness wanderings, okay? He's looking over their past history. He's looking at the law as received on Sinai, not just the 10 Commandments, but the whole caboodle, all right? And what he's doing is he's taking that and he's taking the principles out of it all, and he's applying it to the generation now on the eve of going into the promised land. And so in effect it's a recap. Moses is saying, right, this is what we've learned thus far. Look at our history. This is what God has taught us. Here's the law, all the commandments. This is what we learn from it. And in general, these are the principles that we need to be aware of as you're about to go into the promised land. Because of course Moses, knew by this time that he wasn't going to, and that he would soon die. So really, it's a recap of much of what we've seen in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. It's a recap for the sake of a generation of people who weren't alive when all that was happening. So let's dive straight in and go in at chapter 1. And of course you might not be surprised to know that at chapter 1 you get the beginning of the first discourse, all right? And let's actually read verse 2, because this is very telling. This kind of sets the scene. And verse 2 of chapter 1. And now let's see. Let's read verse 1 as well. These are the words Moses spoke to all Israel in the desert east of the Jordan, that is in the Arabah, opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. These are, this is telling us the location. It takes 11 days to go from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir road. Now, what that little bit of information gives us is quite simply this. An 11-day journey from Mount Sinai to where they are now had taken them 38 years. Where they are now, they'd have got to in 11 days. And indeed, they had got to. In Numbers, we saw it. They got there. But because they blew it, they wouldn't go in. They then were destined to 38 more years of wandering in the wilderness. And, that's what unbelief does. Talk about taking the long way round. And, so it starts with that little, just to give us the geography of this. Everything that's gone before, the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, all right, they were covering an area that they could have and should have done in 11 days. So sometimes if we think, I sometimes feel I'm dragging my feet a little bit in growing in the Lord. One place to look at is the whole area of unbelief. If we're dragging our feet, if we think we're growing especially slowly, now I'm not now saying that we should be in leaps and bounds, because maturing believers take years, but sometimes we can become aware that we're falling behind a bit, and one area to look at is unbelief, because if we're not believing the promises of God, we're going to fall behind. Anyway, what happens is that Moses, at this point, he starts discoursing, and he reminds them how the Lord has commanded them as a nation to go in and to take the land. And he's saying, look, there's the promised land, there's the land of Canaan, and God has commanded us to go in and take it. Your forefathers had a bash 38 years ago and they blew it because they didn't believe the Lord, but now you're going to do it. And he then explains to them how to go about eventually establishing the leadership structures that they were going to need once they got in the land. Sort of very much, do you remember Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had advised him how to set up leadership structures, and at this point Moses says, and when you go into the land, don't forget you're going to need leadership structures as well. So he goes over all that, and then he tells them the story of the sending of the spies, and he goes over this with them. Look, we sent the spies in, and they went into the land, and they saw how absolutely fantastic it was, but they came back saying we didn't have a chance, because there were giants there and the people were fierce and we were like grasshoppers, and they said no, we can't do it. And so Moses is going over this for them and saying, this is how it was that your parents who are now dead, this is how they blew it, and he explains to them how God sort of judged them, and the story of how they changed their minds after God had judged them. They said, oh well, we'll go in after all. This was after God said, well don't, it's too late. You remember they went in and they got marmalised and came out again, and Moses in this chapter, he's going over all this history for the benefit of the people there. And then in chapter 2 he carries on recapping various details about their 38 years of their wanderings, and at that point he then tells them the story of how they defeated the Amorites when the Amorites attacked them, led by King Zion. Then in chapter 3 he moves on to the defeat of King Og of Bashan, and how the Bashanites came to bash them up. I don't know whether that's how they got their name, but it could be. And so he tells them that story, how the Lord delivered them from that. And then he tells them all about the agreement that he'd struck with what were to become known as the Transjordan tribes. You'll remember that Reuben, Gad and half Manasseh, because it was half of the tribe of Manasseh, they decided that this particular area where they're camped at the moment was so nice that they wanted to stay there. And they thought, rather than us go into the promised land, it's so good here, can we make our home here? And you'll remember the agreement that Moses struck with them, that it was okay for them to do that, but only on the condition that they went in, that their menfolk fought in the army in the promised land, and that they would only return and settle in the Transjordan once the rest of the tribes had actually taken the land. And so Moses goes over this, explaining it all to the people so that they were aware what was going to happen afterwards. And then he tells them how God had forbidden him to go into the land. You remember he blew it, he shouted at them, he lost his temper, he called them rebels and sinners and that, and misrepresented God. And so obviously if you're going to be a leader, you're judged with greater strictness. That God said, right, okay Moses, now you've blown it as well, you're not going in either. And so Moses tells them that, how that happened, and explained to them how Joshua had been anointed as his leader, so that they would know that once Moses died, that Joshua would step into his shoes and carry on where he left off. Now in chapter 4, he exhorts them to obey the law, and he really goes into it, reminding them of how vital it is at all points that they live in obedience to what the Lord had shown them. And he warns them specifically of what was to be their greatest danger at all times, and it was going to be idolatry. And as they were going into Canaan, the nations in there that they had to kind of clear out had loads and loads of idolatry going, and the great risk was always going to be that Israel would become contaminated with their idols. Not that they would stop believing in the Lord, but that they would end up believing in the Lord and these other gods as well. The problem with idolatry wasn't a complete turning their backs on the Lord, but that the Lord became one of many gods that they would worship. And so Moses really, explains to them the dangers of that. And of course, in the wilderness, they weren't exposed to any idols at all in the wilderness because they were the only nation there. And yet, do you remember they made the golden calf? So this was always going to be the great danger. Now, if Israel ended up in idolatry in the wilderness, where there was no one to tempt them into idolatry, how much more was the danger of that temptation going to be when they were about to go into a land that was filled with idolatry? And so Moses really kind of, sort of like pushes that home to them. And this chapter really is the keynote of this whole book. And it's the heart of what Moses is seeking to communicate to that generation of people who were going to go into the land. And the whole push behind it was that the Lord is God and that there is no other God beside him. And notice that we saw that in the Ten Commandments. It's not just a question of that there is no other God other than the Lord, but that there's no other God beside him. And the danger of idolatry, I repeat, wasn't that they would stop believing in the Lord and blow him. It would be that they'd have idols beside him, that they'd end up giving him equal place in their lives to these idols and false gods. And of course for us, at the end of the day, the real danger, I would say, for the average Christian isn't falling away and completely going back to the non-Christian life. I mean, some believers do. I mean, I've known people who now they're indistinguishable from non-Christians. And yet I know that once they were genuinely following the Lord, they have totally and utterly fallen away. They're completely backslidden, they're completely apostate. Now, that happens to some, but that isn't the danger that your average Christian, i.e. you and I, face, forsaking the Lord completely. The danger we face is having the world and all these other things on the same level as the Lord. Can you see? That's the danger of idolatry. And that is why for us, I mean, we're hardly going to be getting into Baal worship. I mean, that doesn't tend to happen in the 20th century in Essex, does it? But the point is, the danger in the New Testament is that Paul, all the time, he equates greed and idolatry. You'll find that if you read through Paul. When he talks about greed, he says that is idolatry. Because you might not be bowing down to a totem pole or something, but, for any of us, sort of like a car, a house, you name it, anything in our lives, our hobbies, anything, our work, our jobs, any of these things, legitimate though they are in themselves, can end up beside the Lord our God and become idols, so that God is sharing pole position in our lives with various other things, that are merely things that he gives us rather than things that are God himself. And so that's the push here. And in chapter 4, what Moses is saying, the Lord is God, there is no one else beside him, and because he is the one true God, he is due our utter loyalty and our utter obedience. And that is what Moses really pushes home there. And then he after that he ends this first discourse with sort of doing a bit on the cities of refuge that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Right, now in chapter 5 you get the second discourse, and because these discourses they build on each other. So there's been a bit of a break, maybe of a few days, I don't know how long. And so now the people are gathered back together again, and Moses carries on with his teaching. And here in chapter 5, he starts his second discourse simply by restating the Ten Commandments. And so Deuteronomy chapter 5 is really the equivalent of Exodus chapter 20, and Moses restates what the Ten Commandments were. And of course that was the basis of it all, because when you've got the Ten Commandments, you have summed up what it means to truly follow the Lord. To put him first, to bow down before him as being the one true God, and to live in a way that pleases him. And then in chapter 6, he starts applying it to them. And really in chapter 6 you have an exposition of the first law. And the law number 1, about having no other gods before him. And it's in this chapter that we get, sort of like, the very famous verse of Scripture where Moses sums it up like this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Now that's not quoting the first commandment, but that's what it boils down to. That's what it actually means. And that is why Jesus summed up the commandments partially by quoting that verse, because that's what it boils down to. And so Moses is saying, look, this is in effect what it is. You've got the commandment, I can quote that to you, but this is what it means. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And of course, you remember back in Leviticus 19, and I hope you do remember back in Leviticus 19, when God was restating the commandments to Moses, in verse 18 there, you remember God said to Moses, love your neighbour as yourself. So when God decided to restate the Ten Commandments to Moses, God summed it up with love your neighbour as yourself. When Moses restates the Ten Commandments to Israel, he sums them up by saying you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, blah, blah, blah. And when Jesus in the Gospels summed up the entire law, he put the two together. You shall love the Lord your God with all your blah, 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 and love your neighbour as yourself. Now that comes together as a package. And it's quite simple. You shall love the Lord your God. There's the first 2 or 3 commandments that relate purely to him. But when you come on to the rest of the commandments, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, blah, 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 that's for the benefit of other people. And what you've got in the Ten Commandments is quite simply that if you love God, i.e. the first batch of commandments, that will be shown through your obedience to the rest of the commandments. Because if you love God, you're going to love your neighbour. If you love God, you will not swipe your neighbour's wife. If you love God, you will not steal from your neighbour. If you love God, you won't tell a lie because that's going to hurt somebody else. I.e., if you love God, you'll love your brother. If you love God, you'll love your neighbour. And indeed, the extent to which we can say, how much do I love God, is precisely how much do I love other people. Because the principle that John expounds in his first letter is quite simply, how can you say you love God who you haven't seen if you haven't loved your brother who you have seen? It's as simple as that. And you get it here in this, restating of the law. Loving God with your whole heart, but that boils down to loving your neighbour with your whole heart as well. And that, ultimately, is what the life of holiness is. The life of holiness is the life of self-giving love. Loving God, and therefore loving your neighbour. Because the fact that you love yourself is a foregone conclusion, all right? And that is why it's got to be a little less loving ourselves to make room for loving God and for other people. That's why this thing that you hear in so many Christian circles today, this thing about, oh, you've got to learn to love yourself. A load of rubbish. There's one thing we never have to learn. What we have to learn is how to put ourselves last and to love God and to love our neighbour. And, so therefore we have Moses summing up the law. And you can see why this book is called Deuteronomy. It is a second, a repetition of the law, a second or a restatement of the law as we saw in Exodus. Right, now in chapter 7 he turns their attention to the instructions that God had given them, that they were to drive out and completely destroy the Canaanites. Because, whereas the land was theirs, God had given it to them as a gift, nevertheless it was inhabited by the Canaanites. And therefore, because of the evil of the Canaanites, Israel was to be the means of God's judgment on the Canaanites. And so therefore Israel is commanded that as they go into the promised land, they were to completely drive out and destroy the nations that were already there. And the instructions were that there were to be no marriages with them. They weren't to marry. There were to be no compromises of any kind whatsoever. Obviously, if you had, sort of Canaanites who, as it were, sort of like converted to Judaism and became believers, that was okay. It's like, for instance, when we come on to do Joshua next time, we'll see how Rahab, the harlot, became a believer. And she was a Canaanite woman in Jericho. But because she became a believer, it was okay to marry her. And indeed, she ended up in Jesus' genealogy. She was actually, a forebear of Jesus himself. But the point was that they weren't to intermarry with the Canaanites or have any kind of compromise or fraternising with them in any way at all. The reason being that were they to do that, then the evil of the Canaanite nations would simply rub off onto them. It was as simple as that. And of course, as we keep going with this Bible survey, we're going to see that the future history of Israel from this point was exactly that. The failure to drive out the Canaanites completely, and the constant problem of Israel becoming contaminated by the evil and the idolatry and the occultism and the sin of the Canaanite nations. But here Moses is banging home to them the fact that when you go in there, you must destroy these nations before you. No marriages, no compromising, no fraternising. And then he assures them that God had promised that they would know complete victory in this venture if only they remain faithful to the Lord. And the reason that Israel ended up with partial victory in Canaan was because they were partially faithful to the Lord. But the other side of that is the reason that they partially lost Canaan was that they were partially unfaithful to the Lord. They didn't do the job properly, and it was because they didn't remain completely faithful to the Lord. But what Moses is saying to them here is, look, to the extent that you're faithful to the Lord, to that extent you'll know complete victory as you march into Canaan. And then in chapter 8, he kind of looks back over their 38 years of wanderings. And he explains to them the way that through that time, God was testing them. And, he uses the language of testing and humbling. And he says to them, that through that time the Lord tested you and humbled you, to find out, to know what was in your heart. Now, the point is that obviously God wasn't testing them to find out what was in their heart because he didn't know. He was testing them to show them what was really in their heart. And the main thing that God wanted them to learn, and Moses now says this to them, was that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So this is where that verse that gets quoted in the New Testament comes from. This is how Moses is explaining this is why you were tested and humbled in the way you were in the wilderness. It was so that you would learn that any self-reliance is going to be absolute just disaster for you and folly, and that what you had to learn is that you don't live by bread alone, i.e. the natural life, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Our dependence ultimately is on him. And he explains to them that the manna kept coming, and at this point still is. They're still eating the manna. He's saying God provided for you. Every morning the manna was there and you went out to gather it, no problem at all. He said your clothes didn't wear out. And, that's something we don't often think of. But not one thread of clothing on one Israelite wore out while they were in the wilderness. The shoes on their feet didn't wear out. All that walking they did, God completely sustained them in every way. And it says that their feet didn't swell. And that's a kind of a hazard when you're doing as much walking as they were doing. God provided for them in every way and looked after them completely. And, and yet in the light of that, do you remember we saw that, what were they? They were moan, groan all the time. Nothing was ever right. Now, that's the truth of our hearts. And it's like the more the Lord does for us, the more the sinful nature moans against him. It just seems to be the way. And he reminds them at this point as well that given that the land that they were about to go into was so wonderful, and they were going to stop eating manna soon, and they were going to eat of the produce of the land. And you remember, when the spies went into the land, they pick a bunch of grapes, and this bunch of grapes, two men would bring it back on a pole on their shoulders, because one bunch of grapes weighed so much that one man couldn't carry it on their own. So they were about to swap manna, which was all very well, nice stuff, but just kind of like barely kept, just kept you going. They were about to swap the wilderness for this absolute paradise that they were going into. And what Moses says is that the great danger now that you've got to be aware of is that when you do get in there, when you actually realise how fantastic it is, you've got to make sure that your sheer satisfaction with it doesn't make you forget the Lord. And there's a warning here that coming prosperity could end up making them unfaithful. I.e., because they could end up so taken with their newly acquired prosperity that they're now finding their security and delight in the things God has given them, and they forget the Lord. And there's a very important principle there about prosperity. And it's quite simply this: nowhere does the Bible say it's wrong to prosper. And indeed, Moses isn't saying, look, God's going to make you paupers in the land so the prosperity doesn't take you away. No, he said God is going to prosper you in the land. That's one of his promises. But when that prosperity comes, make sure it doesn't take you away from the Lord. So what we've got is that when the Lord prospers us, it can have two effects on us. It can be a blessing to us that we can share with others. The more you've got, the more you can pass on to other people. Give and it shall be given. It can be a great blessing, all right? Or it can become the weeds that strangle the seed. Do you remember Jesus' teaching in the parable of the sower? The seed that grew up and it was choked by the weeds. And Jesus said that the weeds, were the cares of the world and delight in riches. It's not saying there's anything wrong with riches themselves and prosperity, but it can become a kind of a weed that strangles. And here Moses is saying, when you get into the land, don't end up so taken up with the blessings that God has given you there that you end up actually forgetting the Lord. And of course, as we go through the rest of this survey and see Israel's history in the land, what was one of the things that happened to them? They ended up so taken up with their newly acquired prosperity they forgot the Lord. And that's a warning here that Moses gives them. They didn't take it to heart. We've got to make sure that we do. And so the warning there about a prosperity making you unfaithful to the Lord. And then in chapter 9 he continues to warn them of all the dangers that they're facing in the light of their past rebellion against the Lord. So now he makes them look back at how rebellious and unfaithful they've been thus far. And Moses tells them here, remember that everything that Moses is passing on from here is what God has told Moses. I mean, all this is, straight from the Lord. And Moses reminds them that God's choice of them as his people, why Israel was chosen as a nation, wasn't because of any righteousness of their own. That wasn't why God chose them. In fact, Moses said that in actual fact, we've only got to look back over our short history as a nation, and we can actually see that we're more wicked than the other nations, not less wicked. So he says, don't think that you're being blessed like this, that God chose you because you're righteous. He didn't. He said, you're more wicked, actually, than most of the nations that we've encountered so far. Because when Israel rebelled, it was against such incredible light, such presence of the Lord with them. And, but Moses says, look, the Canaanites are losing the land, not because of your righteousness, but because of their wickedness. So you are the means of God judging them, but don't think it's because you're special, because you're absolutely not. And again, this is the same with us, isn't it? There's nothing, God loves each one of us absolutely to bits. But the reason he chose us isn't because we're righteous. He chose us precisely because we're so sinful and so desperately in need of salvation. And Moses reminds Israel of this principle in regards to themselves. And he reminds them specifically of the episode with the golden calf. Do you remember when Moses was up in Sinai getting the commandments and the law, and the covenant being struck between God and Israel, all right? And Moses comes down from the mountain only to discover that in the meantime, since he's been up there, he comes down with the 2 tablets of stone with the 10 commandments on. He comes down from the mountain only to discover that while he's been up there receiving the law, Israel's decided to make a golden calf and are having a drunken orgy, an immoral drunken orgy around this golden calf, worshipping it. And not only that, Aaron, his brother, who was Israel's newly appointed high priest, was the master of ceremonies. That was the truth about Israel as a nation. And and I assure you that you don't have to look back far on any of your lives, I don't, to see equivalent incidents in my life. in the light of everything that God has done for me, the way I've often been since. And Moses reminds them of this. And the point was that Moses, he comes down, he sees what they're doing, and he smashes the stones, the tablets of stone with the law on. And the point was that, with the law, is that Israel had broken it before God had finished giving it. That was the truth of Israel, and that is the truth of us as well. And so Moses is really making sure, because it would have been a bit easy for this generation of people to kind of be getting a little bit big for their boots, because after all, this wasn't them, it was their forefathers, it was their parents who did all that. What Moses is saying, you're no different to your parents. You mustn't think you are. You're not. Literally there, but for the grace of God, go any of us. That is literally the truth. And so Moses is really making sure that they understand, and that they keep in their place. And he chucks out one or two other instances as well, especially chosen to illustrate their sinfulness and rebellion. And then in chapter 10, he explains to them how the tablets of stone, having been broken, when he came down from the mountain, that eventually the Lord replaced them, and the Lord wrote them out again. You see, and I mean that's good, because as many second chances as you need, you get with the Lord. The fact that Moses smashed them, Israel had blown it. They hadn't actually blown it, because you get all the second chances that you need, don't you? And so Moses tells them how God wrote out 2 fresh tablets of stone with the commandments on, and that they were placed in the ark of the covenant. And then he explains to them how the tribe of Levi were set apart, and that they were the priestly tribe who were going to carry the ark, etc., etc. He goes over all that with them. And then in chapter 11 he goes on to he restates all the blessings and the cursings. So God at the giving of the law had said, if you obey the law, these are the blessings you're going to get, but if you're unfaithful to me, these are the cursings. And so Moses goes over all this, explains it all to the people, and he instructs them that when they actually got into the land, that they would find 2 mountains, one called Mount Gerizim and the other called Mount Ebal. And what they were to do once they were established in the land, and when we come onto the book of Joshua we'll see when they actually did this, that they were to sort of send one person up Mount Gerizim, and they were to read out all the blessings, and someone else was to go up Mount Ebal, and they were to read out all the cursings. And so these 2 mountains, where they went into the land, would stand as a living sermon, so that what Moses is saying to them here, they were actually going to have 2 mountains, dominating the land, as it were, which would speak to them forever of this thing that Moses is saying here, blessings of obedience, but the cursing of rebellion, etc., etc. And then in chapter 12 he outlines more on the conditions of of getting the blessings in the promised land. And he re-emphasizes to them the importance of staying away from any kind of idolatry, and he kind of explains to them that they'd be given certain places in which to worship, so that God would even tell them what sort of worship to be doing in what particular places. And the reason they were given such precise instructions for worship was, again, to make sure that they knew exactly how God wanted it to be done, and to avoid the slipping over into any kind of idolatry. Then in chapter 13 he moves on to the subject of false prophets and false prophecies. And he tells them that false prophets will be raised up amongst them, which was again a perennial problem. And what he's saying here is that some of them would even work miracles. But he's saying that the fact that they worked miracles shouldn't necessarily make you conclude that they're of God. So what Moses is saying here, that when it comes to prophets working miracles, the test is never merely supernatural power. So even in the Old Testament, you didn't have this thing that sadly a lot of Christians labour under this illusion, that the mere fact that a miracle accompanies a teaching means that the teaching is correct. Doesn't mean that at all. And, because obviously Satan can counterfeit miracles. And the test that he gives them is whether or not that prophet and his prophecy ends up leading them away from the Lord into idolatry. So even then, the test was, does this prophecy and does this prophet and his life, regardless of miracles, forget the miracles, forget any power they may have, the test is, how does it square up to the law of God? How does it square up to what God has revealed in his word? And of course that remains the test of prophecy to this day, doesn't it? Of course it does. And then he outlines that that there was to be a death penalty for idolatry, and be it for individuals or entire families or whole towns. And you know, I mean, there were occasions in Israel's subsequent history when certain towns had to get together and they literally had to go and destroy another town that was into completely unrepentant idolatry. And so the point is, there you had individual and corporate responsibility when it came to idolatry. And this was how strong God was going to be on idolatry. But remember, it may sound tough, some of the things that they had the death penalty for, but you've got to remember that in the light of Israel being God's people and God being their king, that the idolatry and all the immorality and stuff like that, because it introduced a foreign power, i.e. the kingdom of Satan, it was treason. It was treason. And it's even today on our law books, treason is still a capital offence. I mean, you know, obviously no one ever gets put to death for treason, but it is interesting that treason, even in this country at this particular time, is still a capital offence. And that was the thing about idolatry. It was literally treason because it enabled the enemy to have a fifth column within the nation so that he could eventually take them over. Because remember, all the time Satan was trying to destroy Israel because he knew that Messiah and the Saviour of the world was going to be an Israelite. So therefore Satan was all the time trying to destroy the nation. Right, chapter 14, he lists out clean and unclean animals for purposes of sacrifices, and also he begins to outline instructions on tithing, which, as you are aware of, was Israel's tax system. In chapter 15, he goes on to explain what was known as Israel's sabbatical year. Now, every Sabbath, you know, it's like 7. Every 7th year was a sabbatical year, and it was a special year. For instance, all debts were cancelled in this sabbatical year. So if you owed money, you had to last out until the sabbatical year. And part of it was a special exhortation of generosity towards the poor in this sabbatic year. Also, slaves would be set free. Now, you've got to understand that slavery in Israel wasn't like, slavery, we tend to think of roots, don't we, and what the British Empire did to the blacks. Well, I mean, it wasn't like that at all. You could sell yourself into slavery to raise money, like mortgaging yourself. So if your family was in debt and, something like that, or you needed money, you'd had a bad year with the harvest or something like that, you could sell yourself into slavery and your family would be paid. You'd be looked after by the family you're a slave to, but the money that you got would, go to your family. And on the sabbatic year, slaves were set free. However, a slave, even on a sabbatic year, had the option to remain with that family, because they were more, you've got to think of it more like upstairs, downstairs, like the slaves were part of the family. And often you get a situation where maybe a son, sort of maybe not that old, so maybe his dad died and he had to look after his mum or whatever, and so he'd sell himself into slavery. But very often they'd end up being virtually taken into the home of the people that they're a slave to, and often they might fall in love with a daughter or something like that, and become like a son in that family themselves. And so what happened was, when the sabbatic year came for the freeing of the slaves who wanted to receive their freedom could, and they walked free. But any who wanted to remain in the family, what they did is they had their ear pierced, and it was the sign that they so loved being a slave in this family that they wanted to stay. And what they were saying is, being adopted, if you like, into this family as a slave is better than the freedom that I'd have outside of this family. And there's that chorus, isn't there, about, pierce my ear, O Lord my God. And of course, it's a picture here that when you become a Christian, you're a slave to Jesus. You're a slave to Father. Of course you are. But the point is, being in slavery, because we're bound by the new covenant, being in slavery to the Lord is far better than the freedom we had when we were non-Christians. So the point is, to be in slavery to God is a greater freedom than the freedom we had when we were still in sin. And, you know, so the idea that our ears are pierced, and also we're slaves, but who are taken into the family and adopted as sons, which is what's happened to us. So you've got all that, you know, sort of like imagery there in regards to slavery. It was very different in Israel. And then also in this chapter on the sabbatical year, that you had a special setting apart to the Lord of all the firstborn of animals, etc., etc. And of course that all goes back to, you know, like in the Passover, the firstborn was all committed to the Lord because it was the firstborn who was spared because of the angel, you know, sort of like passing over where the angel saw the blood, blah, blah, blah. So you've got all that. Right, in chapter 16 he outlines the feasts of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, or Harvest, or Pentecost, that had three names, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. We saw them when we did Leviticus, and he goes over it there. Then he deals with the fact that when they're in the land, they had to appoint judges in every town, you know, to ensure justice, because social justice was a very big theme. So judges had to be appointed everywhere they went. And then you get a bit more, you know, on idolatry, and particular warning against the Asherah poles. These were like totem poles that the you know, that the Canaanites used, and also the erecting of sacred stones for altars. You know, like often, you know, some of these people, they'd have special altars, as it were, but the stones were considered to be empowered, and they were. That's why sometimes when you're reading through Israel's history, you'll sort of read that they set up altars here and there, and then the Lord judges them. And you think, well, I mean, they're setting up altars. Why is the Lord judging them? It's because they're setting up the wrong sort of altars. They're not setting up altars to the Lord. They're setting up these idolatrous ones. So you get warnings about that. Chapter 17, he warns them against using imperfect animals in sacrifices. We saw that in Leviticus, the way that physical perfection represented holiness. A specific instruction that star worshippers, people who worship the sun, moon and stars, were to be put to death, because that was particularly big in Canaan, you know, the worship of the stars. Not astrology per se, you know, this is the actual worship of the stars, but astrology was a definite problem in Canaan, and was certainly idolatrous. Then he outlines, and this is on the judicial system, that where you had capital offences, that someone was to only be put to death if they were convicted on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So no one could ever end up convicted of a crime or a capital offence on the evidence of just one witness. And of course that, you know, prevented a lot of situations where you just had one person's word against another. And then the law that that if someone had been convicted and was to be stoned to death, then the witnesses on whose testimony the person had been convicted had to throw the first rocks. With stoning to death, don't think, you know, like, you know, on a beach and getting a few pebbles. It wasn't. This was rocks. You know, this was to kill someone. And so the witnesses on whose testimony someone had been convicted, they had to initiate the actual execution. And you know, and of course that's that was a good safeguard. It meant that you weren't going to stitch someone up lightly. You see, you couldn't use their judicial system to do your murder for you. If they were put to death on your perjured testimony, you were the one who had to actually throw the stones at them. So that was a safeguard. You know, that the witnesses were the executioners as well. Then Moses deals with the fact that when court cases come up that are too difficult for local civil courts to deal with, because you might have your little village judge, or, you know, the elders and that, and a case might come up that they honestly think, oh, no, this is too much for us, can't work it out, blah blah blah. Then what was to happen then is that it would be taken to the Levites in the area, the priests, and they would then refer it to higher courts and to people who were more expert than maybe the local civil courts. Then he prophesies that eventually Israel would want a king. Now this will feature a lot more later on as we go through the Bible, but here's a prophecy that eventually Israel would want a king. Because of course the point is God was their king. They were a theocracy. God was their king. God spoke to them directly. But here Moses says, one day you're going to want a king. And he reminds them that when they do, they must only choose a man of God's appointing. If they ever get the wrong one, they were going to be in trouble. And they very often did get the wrong one, and they very often were in trouble as a result of it. And that when kings eventually came on the scene, that the kings were specifically forbidden not to oppress the people. So it really was a righteous kingship. Kingship in Israel was to be totally different from the surrounding nations. The king was not to be a despot. He was not to be like a dictator. And there's a warning here that any future kings weren't to be led astray by wanting many wives or by the accumulation of wealth. And it was specifically those two things. It eventually topped Solomon. So there's a warning. And also, when a king commenced his reign, after he'd been crowned, the first thing the king had to do was he had to write out a copy of the entire law, which came to be the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He had to write the whole lot out. So his first act as king was to vanish somewhere, get plenty of papyrus and quilled pens and loads of ink, and he had to write the whole lot out, word for word. And also that he was not to consider himself better than the people. So the point is that when Israel eventually had kings, the first act of a reigning king wasn't to rule over the people. It was to write out the entire law to remind him that he was under the authority of God, the same as everyone else in Israel was. So that's the rules for kings there. In chapter 18, he goes into all the Levites, the priests and the priestly assistants, and how, because they weren't going to have any land of their own, that they were to live off of the offerings of the rest of Israel. And here he specifically covers animal sacrifice, because a lot of the sacrifices, they bring, sort of like their beast along, whatever it was, a cow or whatever. And a lot of the sacrifices, like, the Levite would slit its throat and bleed it, and that was the sacrifice over. The Levite then took it home to his family and he ate it, because he didn't have any land on which he could rear cattle. So, again, the principle that because the Levites were, I suppose, what you might call full-time for the Lord, not a very good phrase, but that kind of thing, that was their full-time job. They were to be supported by the people they were leading, precisely because they had no means to earn money themselves, because their job was working full-time, in leadership in the temple, blah, blah, blah. So they had no means of income. So the principle there that, the servant is worthy of his hire, that. And also that Levites who had a travelling ministry, because some of them travelled, they travelled around like itinerant preachers, that they were to be supported by whatever town they happened to be in at the particular time. Then a warning, and this may surprise you, but it happened again and again in Israel's history, a specific warning against child sacrifice. You might be amazed to think that Moses warns them specifically against human and child sacrifice, but there were many times when Israel did precisely that. And this was the kind of occult practices that were going on in Canaan. Sort of don't think it was just, like these Canaanites kind of on a Saturday night sitting around a Ouija board with a couple of pints and a packet of fags. It wasn't like that. It was really, they were into child sacrifice. They were into every abomination under the sun. And so Moses here warns Israel that they're not to get contaminated by it. As we go on through it, we'll see that they were contaminated by it, and Israel did get into child sacrifice, even at times cannibalism. And then Moses prophesies of the eventual coming of another prophet who was going to be like him, but who would speak the very words of God. And that is obviously a prophecy of the coming Messiah, of Jesus. To this day, Israel is awaiting this prophet who's going to be the second Moses. Moses was considered the prophet par excellence in the Old Testament. As far as prophets go, Moses was it. But Moses here prophesies that someone was going to come along who was going to be like him, but would supersede him, speak the very words of God. Not just be a channel for God to speak here and there like Moses was, but this coming prophet would speak the very words of God. Whatever he said is going to be the word of God. So a prophecy there of the coming Messiah. And then he ends off there with a principle again about predictive prophecy. And that if a prophet prophesies that something's going to happen, if it doesn't happen, then by definition it's a false prophecy. Which may seem obvious to you and I, but believe you me, I have known Christians who have prophesied this, that and the other, and what they prophesied hasn't come to pass. And so do they then acknowledge it's a false prophecy? Well, then say, oh, well, God changed his mind, or Satan hindered it, or something like that, blah, blah, blah. But here, quite simply, if there's a prophecy, a kind of an unqualified prophecy, thus says the Lord, this is going to happen. Well, if it doesn't happen, it's not a prophecy. So little test there to add to the other test for false prophecy. He's already covered with them. Then in chapter 19, he goes over the rules for the cities of refuge. Now, I did this, didn't I, right at the beginning, because that's where we were in Numbers last time when the tape clicked off, so I won't go into that. Then a commandment that they weren't to move their neighbour's boundary stone. And the thing about not removing a neighbour's boundary stone was theft of private property. The idea being that sort of they had boundary stones, which the edge of their property. So I mean, the point is, if someone came along and sort of like moved it half a mile over, they've increased their land by a couple of square miles, but having nicked a couple of square miles, so that's theft of private property. And of course, private property was a very important principle in Israel, because it was how the tribes kept their identity. They could not lose their private property, so it always reverted back to them. Everyone had the same kind of bite of the cherry. You could do what you wanted with your property, you could make it work for you, or you could leave it to rack and ruin, but at the end of the day, that private property could never pass away from you. And in regards to immigration policy, and Israel's immigration policy was very, very good. The principle there is that they were to always welcome what they called the alien and the sojourner. The reason being that they were aliens, they dwelt in Egypt. They didn't belong in Egypt, but for 400 years they were in Egypt. And so the principle was that Israel was always to be completely welcoming to anyone from other nations who wanted to come and live in Israel. A completely open door policy. But the one thing was that immigrants could not have private property. They couldn't own land. So the point is, they received all the rights that every other Israelite would under the law. They were to be welcomed, honoured. There was to be no prejudice in Israel at all, but immigrants couldn't own private property. The reason being, again, to protect Israel, because if you'd had enough immigrants, they could actually end up owning all the property, and if enough Jews lost their land, well, I mean, they'd lose their nationhood, and so it was there to protect their identity in the land there. Then you get the principle that, this is back to the judiciary, witnesses in a trial, all right, on whose testimony someone was punished, be it they got a flogging or be it they got put to death. If you were found to have been a false witness, or if you were discovered to have perjured yourself, then you received whatever punishment the person you lied about either got or would have got if you hadn't been found out. So if you perjured yourself in a capital trial, you were put to death. If you perjured yourself in a trial that would result in the guilty party being flogged, you got that flogging. So again, perjury was linked not to a separate crime with a punishment, but perjury was linked to whatever the punishment was for the crime that you were perjuring yourself about. So a good kind of deterrent there for people being false witnesses. And again, thou shalt not bear false witness. The truth, tremendously important to God, especially as false witnessing, it damages other people. And if you love the Lord your God, you'll love your brother. So you won't want to damage him, so you won't lie. Simple as that. So there you've got that principle there. And it's here that you get the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's explained here in chapter 19. Now, what lay behind this? If someone pokes your eye out, you could go and poke their eye out, all right? If someone knocked your front tooth out, you could go and knock their front tooth out. literally, you could go to them, you get people to hold them down, you could take a chisel to the tooth that they'd knocked out of your mouth. Now, this has been very misunderstood, and it was at the time of Jesus. Jesus had to reinterpret it for people. It wasn't there for vengeance. It wasn't there for vengeance. It didn't mean that if someone blacked your eye, you had to, under the law of Moses, go and black their eye. What this law established is that if someone blacked your eye, if you really do want vengeance, if you're that way inclined and really do think that they ought to be punished, then the maximum that you could do is black their eye. So if they poke your eye out, you couldn't go and chop their legs off. You might feel like chopping their legs off, but you couldn't do it. Can you see? It wasn't there to encourage retribution. It was there to ensure that the punishment fitted the crime. Can you see? Because isn't it easy? Someone does you wrong, all right, and you get the ump about it. Now, when we get offended when someone's done us wrong, what's the first thing we want to do? We want to do even more wrong to them than they've done to us. That's really weird when you think about it, isn't it? There you are, you've got the ump that someone has done you wrong. How dare they do you wrong? So you want to go and do more wrong to them than they've done to you. But there you are, condemning them because they've done wrong to you. See, it was there, as I say, not to encourage retribution or vengeance. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. It was to limit punishment, as simple as that. And when it worked properly, it worked well. Chapter 20, Moses outlines Israel's code of warfare. Remember, they were about to go into the promised land, and like any nation, they got involved in wars. They attacked, they had to defend themselves, and in fact with the Canaanites, they had to actually go and destroy them all. So they were the offensive, sort of party, if you like. And in chapter 20, you get Israel's Geneva Convention, their rules for warfare. And the first one is that, that Moses tells them they're to be fearless, because a fearless army is a lot harder to beat than a fearful army. Owners of new houses or vineyards were to be excused military service. So once you were 20, you could be drafted. It's like if there was a battle, you could be called up. However, if you just bought a new house, or if you just planted a new vineyard, then you wouldn't be drafted. You'd be excused that battle because you were given time to enjoy your house. You were given time to enjoy the fruit of the vineyard. The idea being, if someone has just moved into a house or just planted a vineyard, then they get called for military service, their mind's going to be back home, isn't it? So they're going to be no good as soldiers. So, you get all these reasons that people could be excused temporarily from fighting in the army. Those who are awaiting marriage, about to get married or just got married, they were excused and that. For obvious reasons. You've just got married and then, a week into your wedding, you've got to go and fight a battle. Your mind is not going to be on the warfare. It's going to be on the honeymoon, And they were very aware of that. So you were excused if you were about to get married or if you were a newlywed. Also, before a battle, any who were particularly frightened or kind of cowardly were excused. So blatant cowards or people who were so petrified they could hardly hold a sword up, they got sent home. And the reason for that is so they didn't spread their fear to other people. Because if you have got a coward in the camp, it's the coward who spreads. Courage doesn't spread to cowards. Cowardice spreads from cowards to people who are brave. If you've got people, we haven't got a chance, all right, well, Satan can then work on you. This is what happened when the spies came back from Canaan. They painted such a bleak picture of it that the people said, oh no, we can't go in. Had the people listened to Joshua and Caleb rather than the 10 who were unfaithful, they'd have gone in. And so, the negative spreads. So the particularly fearful and cowardly, were sent home so that they didn't contaminate everyone else. And when Israel faced a battle with non-Canaanite nations, they were to always offer peace terms first. Now, with the Canaanite nations, they had their instructions, no peace terms, they were to go in and wipe them out. But whenever Israel ended up facing a skirmish with non-Canaanite Gentile nations, then Israel was to always offer peace terms first. The ideal was peace. If the peace terms weren't accepted, well, okay, you had to fight the war, but Israel was to always offer terms of peace first. And then also, when laying siege to a city, which was a part of warfare, like cities were walled, you couldn't get in. And so you had to sit outside and lay siege to them until their provisions ran out. Now, any time Israel was besieging a city in that situation, they were forbidden to cut down fruit trees. So, the Greens would like that. It's good that, a little bit of the old nature there, I like that. They weren't to cut down the fruit tree, because they cut trees down to make the siege works, like scaffolding to climb up. Israel weren't allowed to do that. So, you've got a real kind of countryside policy there, which is good. And, right, chapter 21. Let's see, yes, chapter 21, yes. The problem of unsolved murders, i.e. a corpse is discovered, right? Sort of found lying there with a spear in his back or something, out somewhere. What do you do about that? There's no way of finding out who killed him. There's no witnesses. You just find this murdered body somewhere. Now,
that murder unsolved. I mean, obviously, if you solved the murder, it was atoned for by the death of the murderer. But you know, where you couldn't find out who'd done it, then what happened then is that the atonement was to be taken care of by the town nearest to the body. So whichever town the body was nearest, they had to atone for it, and there were special sacrifices, blah blah blah. So they had to sort that out. Then permission is given for them to marry the women of defeated nations. All right. So if they've been in a war and defeat a nation, all right, they were allowed to marry the widows of the soldiers that they killed, and also that should they do this, that the women were not in any way to be oppressed or treated as slaves. They were to be well looked after. So the point is that very often in a battle they would wipe out the entire all the men. They'd wipe them out completely. Now this would leave many women and children completely uncared for. Well, the policy was that they were free to marry them and they were to look after them well. So you get that there. Then you get the rights of the firstborn son outlined. He gets a double share of the inheritance. And it's all, I mean, Jesus was like the firstborn, and we're the firstborn, and you get all that. Then, kind of in contradistinction to the rights of the firstborn, you get what happens to rebellious sons. So so these are male sons, like youngsters, probably in their teenage, who are particularly rebellious, i.e. that their parents cannot control them in any way at all. These kids are completely unresponsive to discipline of any kind. They are to be taken to the elders of the city by their parents and stoned to death. Now we're not talking about little kiddies here, but these are sort of like, your teenage yobbos? Well, that's what happened to them, under the law. They were beyond, because the point was they were beyond any, see? So in a situation like that, when you had, in effect, just a hardened criminal who was totally, gave no response, no thought to the law, to the rights and the benefits of other people, they were actually stoned to death. The reason being is that people like that end up doing so much damage that in Israel they were taken care of before other innocent people died at their hands, which is ultimately what always happens. So that's what happens to them. Just to remind all you parents that we're under the new covenant, not the old covenant. So Gary, I know Adam plays up at times, but don't bring him to me, so we got to stone him to death, for heaven's sake. We're in the new covenant. And then also what's put here, in here, is that when someone has been put to death for a capital crime, i.e. they've been sort of put to death because they've murdered or something, that their body was to be hung on a tree in full public view until sunset, and then it was to be buried. So the point is that they'd be put to death maybe in the morning, and their body would be hung on a tree. And of course this was saying this is what happens if you murder, if you blah blah blah. It was kind of like, capital punish wasn't deterrent. It was to preserve the sanctity of the life that had been wrongfully taken. But nevertheless, there was a deterrent effect in this practice. And of course, it says something about the fact that Jesus was hung on a tree, wasn't he? Because the Romans crucified you on a bit of wood on a tree. Jesus hung on the tree. And, so Jesus took the place of someone who had suffered a capital, offence. So he did that for us, obviously. The soul that sins, it shall die. But he hadn't died. Right, okay, chapter 22. You get laws here on if you find an ox or something that you've got to find out who it belongs to and return it. You get a bit on cross-sexual dressing. Right, I'll put that in more. Right, okay, dressing up as women and women dressing up as men. That's what that means. The non-abuse of nesting birds. You weren't allowed to interfere with birds when they were nesting. Giggling from the corner there. I'm talking. so because otherwise, sort of like the bird's life and mating habits can be totally thrown out. So again, you've got the old nature bit there again. So bit of the old Green Party here. No problem at all. Then you get safety regulations regarding the design of houses. Yeah, like the houses have flat roofs, so you could sort of go up on your roof and sunbathe, and walk around. They had to have ledges so high up so that you couldn't walk off. So there you got like town planning and planning permission, stuff like that. So it's all very kind of sort of like comprehensive this, and then you get various things about marriage violations and what constitutes a violated marriage, blah, blah, blah. Now then, in chapter 23, you get a list of people who were to be excluded from corporate worship. Now, this went as diverse as from Ammonites on the one hand to men who had crushed testicles on the other. So again, it was very, very comprehensive, and the list of those who were to be excluded from worship. Then you get sanitation laws. If you want, that's all to do with digging holes in the desert, that one. I'm not going to go into it. Then, okay. Then you get the laws of asylum for foreign slaves, like so foreigners who have come and seeking political asylum. You get sort of like, what you do about prostitution. You get laws about money lending, rules for making vows, what you can and can't do on someone else's property. I mean, it's like, for instance, if you're walking in someone's vineyard, because you couldn't be thrown off of someone's property. You were free to walk in anyone's vineyard in Israel. In a vineyard, you could pick grapes. You could walk along picking grapes and eating them, but you couldn't pick a bunch. I.e., you could eat as you were in there, but you couldn't load up the bag and go home. That'd be theft. But of course, it did mean that someone who was poor, who was hungry, could wander into your vineyard and eat his fill. But he couldn't go in there with a wheelbarrow and then off down to the market. All that sort of thing. Right. Okay. Chapter 24. You get laws concerning divorce. Sort of like what constitutes divorce. The principle that in your first year of marriage you're excused from the army. So we saw earlier, if you're about to get married, and now it specifies if after you've been married for a year, no military service. No essential piece of equipment was to be taken as security for a debt. So the point being, if someone owed you money, all right, until they paid the money, you could take something of theirs, all right? Say, right, well, I mean, if you've got a spare coat, I'll have your coat. Or so, and you held that as security. But the point was, you couldn't hold anything that was kind of an essential piece of equipment. So, for instance, say someone owed you money, and they were a miller, so they had a millstone that ground up the grain. Well, that's how they make their money. You couldn't say, right, well, I have your millstone, and I'll hold that as security for the debt. Because then you're robbing him of his means to earn enough money to pay you back. So that prevented people ending up not just becoming bankrupt, but losing everything, if you see what I mean. There were no bailiffs. You could never have everything you had taken away. Kidnapping is here listed as a capital offence. Various things about leprosy. And then it goes back to loans and pledges, and the fact that it was forbidden under the law to enter a man's house and take anything, even if he owed you money. So there were no bailiffs. I mean, your next door neighbour could owe you all the money in the world. You can't go into his house and take his furniture or anything like that. Okay? And also, if you ended up with a blanket, if all he had to give you for security was a blanket, then you could hold that during the day, but at night you had to give it back to him so he could sleep in it and stay warm. So again, so there's real fairness here, real fairness. Workers were to be paid daily. All right, so day's work for a day's pay, because they needed it. So no exploitation of workers in any way at all, even immigrant labour. So the rules for labour in Israel applied to immigrant labour as well. See, so you never ended up with a black labour force or anything like that at all. It was all kind of white economy through and through. And immigrants and orphans to receive justice at all times. No one was to be exploited in any way. And gleanings left from the harvest, i.e. when you've harvested your field, you could only harvest it once. You went through it once, picking everything that you needed. All the gleanings that were left on the floor, you couldn't go back and pick them up. The poor went and picked them up. So the point is, those who had fields, they brought the harvest in, but a lot of it is left on the floor. Well, the poor who didn't have harvest in their fields, they could go in and take it home, blah blah blah. And sort of like, and the poor were defined as the alien because they had no land of their own, or widows and orphans. Anyone who couldn't fend for themselves had to be looked after by other people. Chapter 25, the establishment of courts, he goes over that. The punishment was to always fit the crime. Flogging was limited to 40 lashes. Now, you mustn't think of their flogging being like, you see it in the films with the Romans. It wasn't like that. It was 40 of the best. I mean, it wasn't very nice, but it wasn't this thing where people's backs are lashed to bits and they virtually die after 10. It wasn't like that. But they did have corporal punishment even for adults and that. The ox wasn't to be muzzled while it treaded the grains. You have the duties of the brothers to any widows in their families. So if you had a brother and he died, well, you've got duties towards his widow because who's going to look after her? See? So everyone is looked after. You get the thing about honest weights and measures. It was a crime in, sort of like if you weighed out, sort of so many pounds of whatever, it had to be so many pounds. No dishonesty in trading. And in chapter 26, he deals with tithes and stuff like that. Chapters 27 and 28, he goes back to the thing about this Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, the blessing and the cursing on the mountains, and he goes back and gives them details how they're to do that. Now, in chapter 29 and 30, you now get his third discourse. So now he's kind of summing up. So this is, like talk number 3. And in chapters 29 and 30, he just runs over their history since they left Egypt, and and sort of outlines the principle that if they're obedient, they'll be blessed. If they're disobedient, they'll be cursed. Chapters 31 and 32, Moses now hands over officially to Joshua, and he then wrote out the entire law. So that was when he wrote the Pentateuch. Moses wrote the whole thing out. And he gave it to the Levites and instructed them to read it to the people yearly at the various festivals, all right? And Moses and Joshua, they go into the tabernacle together at this point, and God speaks to Moses and tells him various things about Israel's future and how they were going to rebel and stuff like that, and gives him a song that he and Joshua have to recite to the people. And this song is all about their future rebellion. And so they do that. And then God blesses Joshua as the one who's going to succeed Moses and tells him to be strong and courageous, blah, blah, blah. And then they come out of the tabernacle and they recite this song to Israel about all the future rebellion that they're going to be doing, blah, blah, blah. And then God tells Moses to go up into Mount Nebo, which he does, and from Mount Nebo he can see the promised land from the top of the mountain, and there that's when he's going to die. He knows that is where he's going to die. And in chapter 33, before he leaves, God tells him in chapter 32 to go to Nebo. Before he leaves, in chapter 33, he pronounces a blessing on each tribe in Israel, except, for some reason that I just can't work out, except Simeon. Don't ask me why, but Moses, he pronounces a blessing on every tribe, but he doesn't mention anything about Simeon. And so then, chapter 34, he travels to Mount Nebo, and he dies there, and the Lord buries him. And he was 120 years old. And Israel grieves for 30 days. Joshua takes over the leadership. And of course, remember, Moses did get into the land eventually at the Transfiguration. And of course, in the Great Tribulation, he's one of the 2 witnesses, him and Elijah. And of course, bear in mind as well, we know from Jude that in actual fact, after he was dead here and God buried him, he was actually raised from the dead and actually, went to heaven having been raised from the dead. And he's there now physically. And so there you have it, the Pentateuch. What we, the first 5 books in the Bible known collectively as the law. Genesis took us from creation to the beginning of Israel as a nation, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And you remember they ended up in Egypt where Joseph was Pharaoh's number 2. And then 400 years later, you get Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, and they cover, in effect, the period of Moses' life, 120 years. And of course, you've got the wilderness wanderings, you've got the giving of the law, the sacrificial system, the tabernacle, blah, blah, blah. And so here we've got, Moses' death and the commissioning of Joshua, and next time when we go on to Joshua, we see him leading Israel into the actual promised land. And so let's just remind ourselves of dates here. All right. Israel is now on the eve of actually moving into the promised land. All right. Now, God had promised Abraham 600 years earlier that this was going to happen. Now they're about to do it. The date is 1400 BC. So Genesis covered the first 2,000 years or so of history. Then you get a gap of 400 years between Genesis and Exodus, and then Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy cover another 120 years. So that totes up work it all out, and the date is now, with Joshua about to lead Israel into the promised land, the date is now 1400 BC. And we will pick up on that, Joshua and the conquest of Canaan, next time.